All right, can everybody find their seats? We are going to get started. All right, and on that, I will invite Isaac up to lead us.
All right, thank you all for, what would you all prefer? For me to be worried about this, for me to just talk like this, or for me to hold the microphone? How are we doing the volume? So is this fine if I just do this and it gets longer away, or do you want me to carry this around? Carry it around? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so thank you all for coming back. After that very important, contentious, I have no idea what happened, but you all seem in good spirits, I imagine. Well, so again, what I'm interested, as I said earlier this morning, is like, why are we doing this thing that we're doing? I guess I think about this more and more because I was just super impressed with my church members, like coming back to church after the pandemic. I'm just like, what in the, like, so much of life has changed. Everything's harder and people are still coming to church. We care about this a lot. So I just started thinking to myself, what is it about church that matters so much to us? So yeah, so why are we doing this thing called church? And like I said this morning, I think part of it is we just realized we just can't do our lives and our faith by ourselves. Like we really need each other. I mean, Christians should be the first out there to be like, we are the neediest people in the world. Look at us. We get together every week because we just need each other. So we need each other for well-being, for peace, shalom, salam, to understand God's purposes as well, for discernment. No one has all their knowledge, enough knowledge to know what to do, so we need to rely on each other. And the passage that has been significant in the Christian story, for how we sort through and we negotiate our lives together, because like I said, we fail each other, life gets complicated, is this Matthew 16 stuff, Matthew 16 and Matthew 18, that I'll focus on today, all about discernment. So at the end of the passage that we heard from Timothy this morning, 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, is that call to love each other and to be disciplined, to be of sound mind, to be restored. And Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 are about how we become of sound mind together and trust one another. So the Christian faith is all about what God is doing for us now. Yes, we pay attention to the past, what God has done, but we do that for a purpose, right? We're invested in how to live a life now. So we're always taking into account why we're interested in these kind of questions, not others, these issues, not others, because it's just the nature of our lives now. There's some stuff that just wasn't in TikTok is not really in the Bible. You know what I mean? Like there's just things we got to sort through, or technologies. And we need to figure out what's best for us. So we have to discern our changing world and how to be faithful in the midst of it. So authority always needs to be interpreted. We need to interpret the authority of scripture, of tradition, to figure out how to live our lives. Now, Matthew 16, I won't spend a ton of time on this. Just this is kind of the background important passage for Matthew 18. But Matthew 16 kind of lays out how we think, who has the power to interpret scripture, God's purposes for us. And I'll just read the passage real quick. Matthew 16, verses 13 through 19. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." And then Jesus said to them, plural, Jesus says to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And this is the part, I mean, all of it's very interesting, but super interesting. Verse 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Does that phrasing seem interesting to you, like the heaven and earth stuff? Do you remember how Jesus uses that language earlier in Matthew's gospel? Very important passage for like Mennonite folks. Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, when he teaches people to pray, right? And asks for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And here Jesus seems to kind of flip it, right? Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Anyhow, so this passage is super important for church, all churches. You can see kind of the seeds of the Reformation here too, because this, upon this rock, Peter, I will build my church. Catholics have taken that seriously, like what they call the Petrine office. So you're just not part of a church unless you're part of a Catholic church. That's the rock Peter passed on to Pope to Pope to Pope. Anabaptists and others read that differently and say that this sure foundation, this rock, is actually Peter's confession. So, Jesus says, who do you all say that I am? It's plural. And then Peter's the only one that answers and says, you are the Messiah. And Jesus says, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you. That's a confession of faith in God. And so upon that rock, that confession of faith, God builds the church. Jesus built the church. That's how, I want to say that's how we understand it, unless you're a Catholic in here, then that's how you would understand it. That's kind of, if you don't want to be Catholic, that's kind of the way to go with this passage. So it's the foundation of the church. The true rock is a confession of faith. You are the Messiah. And then that confession needs to be spelled out, right? Like, you are the Messiah. Well, what does that mean for my job? What do I do at work? Or how I handle my life at home, or whatever it might be. Like, it takes some leaps, right? And that's what it means to be part of the church, to make those leaps together, to say, we believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And that means something for my daily life, how I treat people, how we organize life together. And that's called in this passage, this binding and loosing. Whatever you bind on earth will be on heaven. That Jesus commissions the church to do. And I mean, what's powerful to me about this passage, this last verse, verse 19, is that God seems to really believe in the church, right? To like risk heaven on the church. Whatever you bind will be bound in heaven. God entrusts heaven to the church. I mean, that's kind of powerful in how I read this passage. It also shows that God's just not an anxious presence like I am. I mean, I worry about a lot of things. God doesn't seem to be that worried. He thinks that, Jesus thinks that, these people, these disciples, they got what it takes to make life happen. So I'm just impressed with this God as a non-anxious presence. Perhaps even we could even say God as non-coercive. I wonder about maybe if that language is helpful here, to think about how God wants to order the world. God entrusts that order to us. It's not imposed. It's something to be discerned. So that's kind of Matthew 16, what I wanted to draw out for the purposes. Yeah. So given this power that we have, this authority that Jesus has given us as the church, how do we exercise it with care? I think that's the main question I want to get at this week. How do we exercise that authority, that power with care, for the mutual benefit of all of us, for the wholeness of all of us? John, you can put that. So walk through this passage here, Matthew 18. I guess maybe like part of me, since I didn't grow up a Mennonite, and I've been adopted into the family. I always feel like I have to convince myself that I'm really a Mennonite and Anabaptist by going to these old school passages that are just kind of awesome. Like this is a central passage for Mennonite life. But I also think that another reason why this passage has become more and more important to me is in my involvement in like organizing and social justice movement stuff and activism. It's just so clear to me that we struggle just as people with how to like make decisions together and how to hold people accountable. Like this is just like a widespread problem that we have. And so all these groups that I've been a part of, these are not Christian groups, are always trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of like, wait, no, how do we really like, if someone's bugging us or doing something wrong, how do we do it? I don't want to like impose my beliefs on them, or you know what I mean? Like all these questions start coming up. And I just think Jesus was onto something here. And something that we should learn how to live with and to share with others. So anyhow, so this is a foundational passage, like I said, early in the Baptist, because it's all about discerning what it means to be an egalitarian community that's discerning the life of the body together. You don't have an authority to tell you what to do. You kind of have to just start figuring out what to do. You got the Bible, start baptizing some people. They're like, oh my gosh, we're a church. What do we do? And trying to figure out what's acceptable and unacceptable. What are the kind of lives that we want to live? Kind of like, how do you figure out your house rules? How do we do things here in our house? Here at home, how do we live our lives together? One of the early reflections, early Anabaptist reflections on this passage, kind of playing out what it means for community life, is by 16th century person Balthasar Hubmaier in this pamphlet that he wrote called Fraternal Admonitions, the basis. The reason why I like him so much, I mean, he's just very realistic about how life is complicated and what we need to do. But he signs his like treatises, his documents with "truth is unkillable," which is totally badass. I mean, it's just truth is unkillable. Wow. Anyhow, so this is about the just a little more background about it here. This is about the self-regulation of a community of care. That's how I think about this. Where there's a concern for the well-being of each member and the group as a whole, that everyone is important to the life of the community, and we need to somehow make a wholeness possible for people, for peace to be possible. And there needs to be a process to maintain the health of that community, of that movement. Is this passage from, I'll just read it. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out, this is Jesus' word, sorry. Oh, maybe I should set it up too. So right before this is a parable. If you have your Bible, please correct me if I'm wrong on this. But right before this is a parable about like the lost sheep and the vulnerable, like Jesus sacrificing, you know, the 99 to go find the one. I'm pretty sure that's the one. So it's about like how to care for that one vulnerable person or sheep. And then right after this is another parable of the servant who's forgiven everything and then refuses to forgive just that little bit. So someone refuses to forgive. So that's kind of the context. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If you are listened to, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of two or three witnesses. If that person refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. So you hear it again. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if my brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? It just sounds like so bratty right now, don't you think? It's like, oh. As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. All right, so just walking through here some what this reveals about community life, how to implement this. This is my favorite kind of theology, actually. Like, I just get so impatient when like people do theology as if like imagining what God is like. This is theology. Like, what are we doing with our lives because they matter to God? So I love this kind of stuff. Anyhow, so first thing, there's just an assumption, a realism that we will wrong each other. Like I said this morning, we wrong each other. I mean, that's just what it's like to live with us fragile, frail, complicated people, creatures. Life involves all sorts of mistakes. We let each other down. We're always disappointing each other and ourselves. We sin. We cause hurt and harm to people. And this passage is all about, I mean, it just assumes all that, right? It doesn't say, we should care about this. That's just the assumption that Jesus has. Therefore, this is all about how to take responsibility for our actions and to hold people accountable to theirs. It's that simple. How do you take responsibility for what you've done, and how do you hold people accountable for what they've done? Second thing, laws, rules always require interpretation, right? I mean, you can come up with all the laws you want, all the ordinances. Somebody has to implement them. Somebody has to interpret that, right? I mean, this is why there are so many attorneys in the world. The law is very clear, you think, and then there's debate. Someone interprets it. So all laws. So laws don't resolve things. Rules don't resolve things. It's all about how you work them out, the implications they have for community life. It's all about interpretation of our context, of where we are. And our situations change, right? And the way we do things might be a little bit different from the way you do things. Well, don't we care about the same God? Well, maybe we should sort out what these differences mean. Can we live with this difference? Can we maybe not live with that other one? Third thing. These does feel nice. Third thing, Jesus here prioritizes relationships, right? I mean, it's all about what if this person does this to you know what I mean? It's interrelational. The concern is about a broken relationship. It's not a concern about the law. It's not a concern about an abstract moral code. There's nothing here about a need to uphold some kind of like cosmic law or transcendent order that's been around since forever. It's very personal, right? Instead of all that, Jesus provides guidance on how to keep us from destroying ourselves and our community. This is just how you handle each other so that you just don't make life miserable for yourself and others, and you don't hurt each other. And that's particularly there in that that passage, Matthew 18, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, loosed on earth, loosed in heaven. How that repeats line for line, Matthew 16. Just this sense of there's no urgency for Jesus here to preserve that cosmic order, whatever that might be. Instead, or internal law. Instead, it's just about Jesus helping us find ways to be good people with one another to glorify God. Nothing about protecting God's law and order in the abstract. It's all about personal relationships. I'm just impressed with this way that God is kind of like has some kind of dispossession, right? Maybe it's the opposite of that first form of power that I said, power as possession. Like God doesn't seem very possessive, or Jesus doesn't seem very possessive here about God's order. There's a flexibility to it all for the sake of human discernment by the power of the Holy Spirit in the community. The emphasis is not on like, oh my gosh, a law has been broken, what are we going to do? But it's about broken people, about what we do. That's a good one. Not about broken laws, but broken people. Yeah. Just realizing that it should be the title of this talk, I guess. The question isn't oh my gosh, will God ever forgive me? You know, the sense of like guilt at what I've done somehow offended God. Will God be compassionate with me? That's not the concern here, but instead it's, will my neighbor forgive me? Will my neighbor, my friend, will this person that I have sinned against, will they extend mercy to me? That's the concern. All right, so that's kind of all what's going on there in terms of like the broad sweep of what this means for our lives. And let me just like outline the process here as I see it. Not as I say, I mean, what's really nice about this passage is it is a process, right? Like it's just really clear. So what it means is that everyone, so this is the process. First point, everyone is empowered to confront another member of the community. You don't need the pastor to do it. You don't need the priest to do it. You don't, you know what I mean? It's everyone. This is everybody's job. We're all in this together. We don't need specialists to help us figure out what exactly went wrong, who did what, whatever. You don't need the authorities. You don't need professionals. This is a shared authority. Every voice matters. Someone's hurt, someone's experience of hurt is enough. There's no need for like an external validation of that sense of hurt. 2, sometimes people are bullies, right? I mean, there's this stuff about like, you got to take somebody with you sometimes to confront somebody. It's because sometimes we're bullies, right? I mean, that's just sadly the way we are. And even in church, people can be bullies. I mean, hasn't everyone had an experience with somebody who's just really challenging at church? Or maybe this is just something pastors experience about maybe it's the pastor. I love my church. Just being recorded. I don't know. Even in church, we're bullies to each other, you know? So you might have to take a friend or two because someone is scary and you don't trust them. So like you bring your buddy. Third point. If someone doesn't commit to change, to stop hurting people, then they just need to go. They need to leave. They need to be gone. It's just not good, right? If you take that person out. If they're not able to acknowledge it to your buddy or to the rest of the church, like you need to stay away because you are bad for yourself and us right now. You're hurting people. But 4, that's all done for the purpose of repentance. For the person to have some time away so that they can finally commit to change, so that they can be restored to sound mind, like what we heard earlier, so that they can repent, so they finally get to the place where they can apologize. It's also an opportunity for like mutual understanding to develop, like, why the heck did that happen? What is going on here with this person and with us? So a sense for room for discernment, for people's minds to be changed, maybe even, but to change our understanding of the situation and what are the factors at play. And then finally, it's an exclusion, you know, the person who just needs to leave. It's an exclusion for the sake of hope. And I think this is just so key in this passage where Jesus says, let such a one, you know, the person refuses to listen, so you gotta get rid of them. Let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector, you know, these are people who are outside the community. But even Gentiles, as we learn in the Christian story, even Gentiles and tax collectors can change and become part of the people of God. So there's even this hope there with these categories of people that Jesus names, that it's not the end of the story. There's something still that might happen. So it's an exclusion with hope. People are not beyond redemption, but they need some way to find time to change, space to change. Right. So that's kind of does that make sense in terms of a process of what's going on here? Any thoughts about that? Okay. Some warnings. Some warnings, and maybe I should say these warnings about how this passage is used became very important to me as I was sorting out John Howard Yoder's sexual abuse. So I was on, I first, my appointment to the executive board of Mennonite Church USA, I think it was our second meeting where we voted to open all the archives to and find a historian to write about them, which are probably using. And so I'm just like my introduction to Mennonite leadership was being like, well, yes, we need to be honest about this. Let somebody. So yeah, so that's part of it, is just trying to sort through how he was able to manipulate processes to abuse people, to harm women especially. So here's some warnings from how I've noticed this passage being used. Is that, I mean, the first thing in terms of warnings, number one, is that no matter how good a process is, it can be manipulated. I mean, it's not the fault of the process, right? We don't trust processes. We have to somehow manage trust amongst ourselves to use the process as a tool. Processes are tools, and they're able to be manipulated, not because it's a fault of the process, but it's our fault because we can be really manipulated. So that's the first point. You can't like say, oh, well, I just followed a process, therefore it's going to come out of it. No. That's how he was able to deny his allegations, and we don't have to get into all that. Second point is that, you know, this process is very compact here, so it kind of can lead you with the impression that can happen in like a weekend or something, or a week or a month. But no, I mean, the warning is not to force a process upon a situation that needs time. So that's my second point, that forgiveness and possibly reconciliation might take a lifetime. It might be a lifetime thing we need to struggle together. We shouldn't rush to forgive or force people to think that they have to forgive quickly. We have to make room for healing. Everyone's different in their healing processes. We need to make room for each other and to heal in the ways that we need to heal. And that's this context for this passage, is how to practice mutual care for a community, to make room for people. And that there's no formulas for forgiveness. No one should be forced into that kind of formula or of what restoration might look like. We figure it out as we go, what's appropriate for the broken relationship. And at the end of the day, what's important, what we've been given here, this authority, is to make space for the Spirit to work out healing of ourselves, our brokenness, of the people involved. And so church is how we hold that space open. I've experienced, you know, in my church work, thinking about being a pastor, where somebody wrongs somebody, not as egregious as abuse, but, you know, all the common ways we do it, harm each other, hurt each other's feelings, and the way we are trying to be church together. And a response has been like, I'm just out, I'm gone, right? Like I'm just out of here. And, you know, like that makes sense sometimes. But what we can do as a church is to say, you know, we're holding this open for a process that might happen at some point. We will be here for this process. So it's that kind of thing that's in this passage. Let me leave some questions or comments. Okay, so maybe to kind of start closing us here, these are what I have prepared. You know, I kind of made fun of Peter's question there at the end in verse 21. I'll just read it one. So after Jesus lays out this process, Peter came to him and said, you know, he's thinking it through, right? Like, how does this play out? How many times is this going to happen? My brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And Jesus says to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. And then he gives that story of the servant, the parable of the servant who is forgiven but doesn't forgive. What I think is important about to notice about Peter's question is, I think Peter is basically like all of us, or we should identify with Peter in this story. The whole direction of this passage leads us to this kind of question as you sort through the implications of what's going to happen. You know, who's wronged me? How have I been wronged? We can't blame Peter. Jesus kind of set him up for this kind of question. This is the setup. But what's interesting to me is the way that Jesus turns everything around with that parable that comes later. It's that story about the person who's forgiven a huge debt, like I said, and then who turns around and punishes someone who owed him just a little bit of money. Well, it was a lot for the person, so a smaller amount of debt. It causes us to, the parable causes us to consider who has forgiven us, that we are the ones who are in debt to others, to ask ourselves, who have we wronged and whose forgiveness we need. So I think that's what this challenge is here. So Peter, like us, our first response is, wow, if this process works out, I might be having to forgive somebody over and over again. But then Jesus flips it and says, no, who have you wronged? Right? Like, what process needs to happen for you to find your healing of the relationship with the person you've sinned against? What debts have you not forgiven? So it becomes about the way that we have to consider, we have to take stock of our relationships and to say, you know what, maybe I sinned against this person and I should be held accountable for that. So I think that's what's brilliant about the way Jesus works in that parable. So in the end, as I mentioned this morning, we are always in need of somebody else's mercy. I think that's the takeaway from this passage. We're in need of forgiveness, of restoration. Even if we have a list of the people who wronged us, there's got to be somewhere in there where we can figure out where we wronged somebody. And that might be a good place to start in terms of building the wholeness that we need as a community. What do we need to do to making right what we've messed up and to do our part in a healing relationship, the healing as a community? And this is what God is about at the end. This is what we see in verse 20 there. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. This promise of Jesus's presence is through this process of becoming a healthy community of care. Healing is how we welcome God as the community we are in. So that's what I prepared here, and we have maybe like 5 minutes or so for questions or comments. One of the things that I always get annoyed with myself is that I just get kind of get bored of listening to myself talk. And yeah, so I'm hoping that some of you have some insights to share of what this passage means for you, or kind of how I've explicated it, laid it out for you all, what's been helpful, not helpful. Right. Yeah. So I think what's going on here in this passage is, the kind of harm. Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question is how we think about grace at work here, because it does not seem like extending grace to somebody when you have to exclude them, to leave them out for the sake of the community. Is that some of that? Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I think what this process lays out for us is that grace can be a part of the whole process. And part of what this text imagines is somebody who, when they're confronted again and again about what they're doing by multiple people, and everyone's of accord that this is really harming our community, this is harming this person, you got to stop. And that person says no. And then at that point, you're just like, well, we are committed to being a community of peace and well-being where people can be safe and healed, and you are harming us. So you need to go figure it out, and then we can figure out how to include you again. Does that make sense? So it is, and I mean, the other part about it is, like, I'm just trying to think of examples. I mean, I can think of one person where they were just so caught up of not having good sense about their activities in the world. It was related to addictions, and they knew it. Like, they knew that what they were doing was harming their relationships, harming themselves. And no matter what was being done, they just needed some way to be told, like, look, this is really disturbing you and us. We need a break to figure out how healing is going to happen. So I think sometimes this, I mean, this is what this process imagines, is some people who are so consumed with, like, just the chaos of this world, that they need to be sorted out and some space to sort that out. I think that's also grace. Yeah. Oh, just go ahead. Yeah, so Gentiles and tax collectors is here in this passage. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, repeat the question. How did Jesus relate to what do you call them, publicans and sinners? Yeah. Yeah. And so yeah, so I mean that's an important point. So I mean, what's interesting about Matthew's gospel, I don't want this to be too much of a tangent, but Matthew's gospel is not like Luke's gospel, because in Luke's gospel, Jesus has, and Luke and Acts, there's lots of room for Gentile inclusion. Matthew's gospel does not imagine Gentiles becoming part of the people of God. It's a different take. And this is why, yeah, we can go into all that. But like, so for him to say Gentiles here is like, these are just not our people. These are not us. Tax collectors, I mean, they're part of the Roman Empire. They're not us either. So these are definitely outsiders who are not imagined to be part of the community. And the Jesus of Matthew, it's more complicated in his relationship to those folks than it is in Luke. But I want to say that I'm a Gentile and I'm a part of this people. So at some point, like, things shift, and there could be a time frame where Gentiles can be included. So, but yeah, I think that's an important point. Here.
Well, I was actually going to say the exact same thing that Amzi said. But the way I would look at it is, if you exclude them from the community, that just means they're not in the community, but the effort toward them, at least in the way Jesus would have done, increases if you're treating them like a Gentile and a tax collector. They're not here, but the effort toward them increases once they're not part of the community, at least in the way Jesus said. Then the other thing I've always been kind of intrigued by is, it's almost like the first part of this is setting up a trap or a trick. Because if your brother or sister sins against you, that gives one person the sole authority to make that decision. I can decide who sinned against me. And the trick of that is, once you have to go and talk with them, it starts to maybe get murky. And once you have to put that information out in front of two or three others, you start learning that you might have been wrong about who you thought was sinning. And it doesn't say that, but what's probably happening in this passage is I'm learning a lot more about who I think sinned than I am getting vindication for my belief that you sinned.
Yes, I mean, this is a great point. And basically that's what I've been trying to say with creating space for discernment and understanding, and for our minds to be changed, right? It's this, like, as soon as you start having to say exactly what happened, you start realizing what's at stake for you, what's at stake in this other person, and you might rethink what it means. Yeah, so that's a very good point. Yep. This creates the opportunity for minds to be changed, for mutual understanding to be developed. Yep. Yes. No, that's not a silly question. So the question is, so when we do find out, or when we experience somebody's harm, somebody's sin against us, against others in the community, does that invalidate what they've shared, their knowledge, their wisdom, that they've offered to the community? Basically, that I mean, that is such a good question, and it is a live one right now. And people are writing books that enable them to get tenure on trying to figure out this question. And I mean, I do really think that it's like a perennial question. It's not just a Christian one. This is things people worry about for all sorts of folks. What's his name's the director who married his like stepdaughter? Woody Allen, right? Like Woody Allen films. You know, like, so it's not just like, oh my gosh, Christians have such a big problem with like, you know, harboring bad people or John. I mean, no, this is just what it means to be human and trying to sort through what to do with people's legacies. And I don't have an answer. I'm of the opinion that like, once you learn something from somebody, I mean, it's kind of in your head. And it seems a little disingenuous to say that you can just get rid of them. Instead, I think the task is to realize or to think through what it means that that kind of knowledge appealed to me. What does it mean about me? And how do I not pass along any kind of collateral damage that might come with it? I think it's just case by case sort of through. I think it's a different question. Let's just make sure other people. I mean,
So I think something's come up a little bit here is about the God's non-anxious presence and how that works. And that's, I think, is very tied to power, right? If you're non-anxious, you can do this mutual a lot easier. And if you become anxious, easily turns into eternal or possessive. And then that sort of that follows with the person that can't forgive. You see that possessive power. This works really good when you're non-anxious. What happens when you deal with high anxiety? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, high anxiety discernment is just, it's not the best. So yeah, and I think what's built into here are moments for some pausing and some space, because you know you got to go to somebody else, bring a buddy, you got to organize like a meeting at church, you know. So hopefully it's not just like, oh, you did this thing, the pastor determines that you're now excommunicated or you're banned, or the bishop is ultimately, I mean, the bishop being like you're banned. So I do think there's like some process built into here, so hopefully people can slow down. And I don't have a good answer, but I'll close with a story because I don't want to get too much more into next workshop. My story about unanxious presence and what it means to do discernment is when I volunteered with a CPT, a Christian Peacemaker Team. Oh, now at the time it was called Christian Peacemaker Team, delegation in the West Bank in Hebron, Al-Khalil. And as I was getting trained by the delegation, because we were going to do school accompaniment. So there's these Palestinian kids. I mean, they were just like, kindergartners, first grade, that they had to walk from their homes to the school in the morning, and they would have to walk past a Israeli settlement, an illegal Israeli settlement, and people would come out and throw rocks at the kids. And so what CPT would organize is like just walking with kids, holding hands, which I did when I was there. And so to prepare me for like this, you know, this is going to be tough. They're like, things happen that are uncontrollable, but we're committed to doing egalitarian discernment. This is what we're committed to, no matter how stressful things get. And so I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And like, no, I don't think you understand. So last week, we were doing this, and you know, something happened. Don't even know quite why, but one of the IDF soldiers, Israeli Defense Forces soldiers, started shooting tear gas in the vicinity of where they were at, where they're walking the kids. And so, but they're committed to walk the kids to school. And so they were trying to figure out what to do. And so they just quickly huddled together and said, what are we going to do? And just like went around the circle and came to one mind in the matter of like a minute or two and decided to take another route, which was more risky because it went by another settlement. And yeah, I was just like, that is absolutely amazing in terms of a commitment to experience a stressful moment. You see, we're so committed to organizing our lives this way that we will do this egalitarian discernment, and the stress produce the result that worked. I don't know. That's not exactly what you're saying, but I do think one of the things I do believe is that this kind of discernment process, or a commitment to mutual discernment, is how we open ourselves to the miracle of the Holy Spirit. To say, you know, sometimes the Spirit gives us options that we could never come up with on our own, if we open ourselves to those possibilities. Thank you all. I don't know if are we going directly to the next one.
Yes, let's take a 5-7 minute break. I know it's a full afternoon. And then I'll be giving the next session. So I will ring the bell when we're ready. Thank you. Thank you so much, Isaac. That was wonderful. We appreciate it.